I don't know if it makes sense that given my background at least, that the 100th video that we do has to do with site size. It's a funny thing because what it sounds like when I'm talking about site size is that I'm just being a naysayer and criticizing people that should be my friends, and why be negative in the 100th one, right? Why be negative anytime, right? But there's a certain amount of best practices that includes, if you're saying best practices, it means don't do that, do this, right? So my question from Lynn, and this did come in, was talk about the differences between relational and site size working. Here it is on your screen. Might it be useful to know site size when first getting started? I'm going to go back through these, by the way, so let me read it all and then I'll come back. Is there a problem with learning what it's all about? It fails when A, circumstances don't allow the ideal conditions. We talked about this last week. I'm trying not to this is a follow-up, by the way. This is part 2 of site size. So get that in your mind. So I'm not, and I'm trying to avoid doubling up, but I'm going to have to repeat some things. But anyway, B, it inhibits looking at the whole. It keeps painters from looking relationally. Is that essentially the problem, right? And that I didn't even address the question of looking at the whole, but let's talk about it from the first points here. The difference between relational and site size working is if you call site size a method, it's like night and day. If you call it a place on the floor, it's irrelevant. There's no difference. The site size, having your canvas up here or there isn't a problem. You can work relationally in site size. But it is a problem when you say method and you start doing what this method is that is proffered in the Barg course, in the book on Bargs, with all those pictures of the Barg plates and that sort of thing. Which, by the way, if you ever use those things, blow them up to the right size and use charcoal so you're actually doing it like they're doing it, or find reproductions that are lithographs because they really do look like the charcoal, but that isn't pencil drawing stuff mostly. I don't know if any of it is actually. So people think they can just transfer it. It's nowhere near as wise to do it. If a guy's painted, it's like copying an Ang it's done in red chalk, copying it in pencil. It's not the same thing. Or copying a Raphael in pencil when he actually did it in red chalk. So you aren't going to get the same benefits from it, even a little. So I think that's problematical. But anyway, do you understand what I'm saying though? Really clearly have it in your mind, though, that there is no problem with site size in relational painting if you don't mean the site size method. It's the method that nobody used historically, and that's what we can prove here. There's the method, I mean, that these guys attached to Gamble, and I mean literally Gamble attached to me. He did, and his students laid out this thing where everything was about measuring, like literally transferring data from nature to the canvas. So, might it be useful to know site size when first getting started? Now that's really, again, exactly the same problem, right? Because it's not useful to measure first. It's useful to draw and see your errors and correct them by observation, by learning to say, oh, I made that head too big in relation to the body, But to measure things beforehand will never get you to be a good proportion maker. It'll get you to be a good measurer. But that kind of measuring, mechanical measuring, isn't the measuring you need to have. You need to have visual measuring. You need to have the capacity to see how big the head appears when you get down to the foot, And to be able to see those things, by the way, in a version of isolation, It's not when you get the whole figure finally done, you can finally see the heads off. You got to find ways to see that the head size is off as you're putting the initial marks in there, but not by measuring them onto there so you have peace and safety. I keep telling students, this is the idea of the deep end of the pool, right? Swimming requires you to let go of the side. With that mechanical measuring, is measuring the side of the pool. And I don't disagree with Bilmes that it's a version of tracing. I like that idea that he says the side-by-side tracing is kind of really truly what it is. Now, I have to say this right as soon as I say that, though, that side-by-side tracing, if you're an impressionist, there's a rationale to what you're doing that's different from if you're a non-impressionist. By the way, an impressionist, I mean a person who's trying to paint with authority and honesty exactly what he sees in front of him, the way the Boston School talks, right? Straight and true like a Christian. There's a different kind of painting out there, and I see it frequently in the older and historically. It's a type that shows up historically, and that is using the model as a rough just have the model stand there and then use it from time to time for something or other. Even use it to get some rough idea, but you never actually really are trying to make it like. Well, in the training of students, you are trying to get people to try to make it like. This isn't an art school, right? It's a training school to be able to see relationally, to draw relationally until there's a likeness, right? And one of the funny things, I talk about articulation. If I'm actually trying to get you to draw this shape here, I don't mean to draw something like it. I mean to actually learn to draw the actual shape. That's a skill. I mean, that's. Can you do that, right? Well, so a lot of painters will just sort of go toward it and get it something sort of like it and that sort of thing, right? Well, if you go all the way over to the extreme, you have a Malay type, right, who's just painting out of his head entirely, and there's nothing consequential about the look of nature at that spot. But to an impressionist, there is. That's the guy painting the scene in front of him and drawing forth the magic from the look of nature itself. And that's it. That really is kind of crucial to understand. And I don't know if I can clarify it anymore, but I want to make sure I've mentioned it. All right. So is there a problem with learning what it's all about? Is it useful to know sight size when first getting started? I think it's deadly bad. Is there a problem with learning what it's all about? Is there a problem with learning what it's all about? Yeah, no. Actually, there's no problem with knowledge, right? You need to know things. But there are best practices. So if you understand what sight size is, it's a lot easier, in my view, to understand what you're doing when you're working relationally, right? Or in other words, you're understanding what you're not doing, right? And that's kind of fun, isn't it? You know what I mean? So that's clarity. I used to say that I discovered in the working as I evolved as a student, that the truth is in the conflict of ideas, right? So sight size is sitting there as like a boogeyman, sort of in a sense, helping you to understand what you're not doing. That doesn't mean at the end of the day you're going to be less accurate than anybody else. I'm talking about just the ability of a student to draw what he sees, right? As a training thing, not as art, right? Don't confuse it. Virtually every art school, one of the things I don't like about art schools is that they continually are making art instead of creating a power base for you, which is the mastery of truth, right? The ability to express truth in front of you, just as a platform, right? So I don't respect that when it happens. But no, so what, in that sense, I don't have any fear of any knowledge, in a sense, right? I mean, you might say that I certainly have a fear of some knowledge for my kids before their time, when they don't have the judgment to understand something, and they would fall into it like a temptation. And I don't want to get into what that would mean. But anyway, is it limited to failing when circumstances don't allow the ideal conditions? I talked about that last time. You can't paint sight size in backlight because you can't turn your canvas the other way. If it's required that the painting be lined up with the canvas, and there they are sitting right in front of you, both of them in happy light. Well, how are you going to do it when the model is in backlight? So that means you're turning your whole thing is turned the other way, and there's dark. Your canvas is in the dark. You can't paint in the dark. That's just in the class of things you can't do. But again, what I said to you last week, quoting that Degas, you can't paint the sun with the yolk of an egg. So you can't just sit out there and match notes, which Gamble literally had us doing. He had me doing. He actually said, just make this match that. And he said to other people, there's going to be a note in nature outdoors when you go out there that you can possibly just match. Well, that's exactly problematical, because you can't just match. It'd be coincidence if you could match one, but you wouldn't base anything on matching one. First of all, because the idea of matching gets you at the wrong headed, right? But you don't even think about that anymore. You just simply say, all right, what's the range in which we're going to work? That's why Monet puts out a bunch of notes, so he can see where the field is. He can begin to see what he's working with. So he sets things out and gets this out and get darkest darks, lightest light, rich notes, red notes, green notes, the scattering of these things around there, so he can begin to see what the field is, so he can begin to see whether that will deliver what he sees as a whole, right? And that gets us to that next question, which is the problem with it that it inhibits looking at the whole? Well, I mean, what you can measure all day long, and then having drawn all this way mechanically, you can look at it and see how it's off. You still can see how it's off. I mean, students I had came out of the LAC background would do that. They would sort of do the sight size thing, and then I would come in and I would show them how they were off, and they would look at me blankly sometimes and say, "But I measured it." And I would say, "Well, I can't help you with that. You measured it all day long, but obviously measuring may not be the solution to this thing, right? Because your relationships are wrong. So if your internal relationships are wrong, what good was measuring, right? Especially if you say this is that, this is that, this is that, and all that sort of stuff. And there's so much of a trap in so many ways. You have nothing to lose but your chains, I assure you, by getting out of sight size. So it does inhibit looking at the whole, because you don't. But it just inhibits you in looking at more than the thing, right? It does inhibit you a bit. And then, so that's good. And then it keeps painters from looking relationally. That's the whole point of this. Now, what I'm going to do is go through some other stuff, and we're going to look at some of the things in that Bilmes article, Semyon Bilmes, who, as I said before, I think is Russian trained. So, all right. Now, so this picture shows up in that article. This, the way I'm doing this now, with apologies, is you can't see my face for this, but you're just going to have to look at these independently. But look at the images. Can I make this smaller? I can't, so I'm just going to move this up and down a little bit so you can watch it that way. But if you look at these images and follow, I'll try to use my arrow in some useful way. The point he's making is nobody in this room is actually setting up in a sight-size way in any of these situations. So this is the Beaux-Arts, this is David's studio. These are paintings done in those studios representing what was happening in the educational thing. So the Julian Academy, the Academy Julian, Antwerp, that's this one here. Now, these, you can find all these online, I think every single one of them, but they're definitely in different books. This says French Atelier, 19th Century Academy. Look at all these crowds of people here. There's no way to set up in sight size. You could say that, the smart people set up in sight size, they get themselves independent. Once you're independent, you'll have your own studio, you can set up any way you want. But the training obviously isn't a sight size training, and it's definitely not by that mechanical process that's described in that book. So each of these is in that class. Now, at one point or another, you're going to see different people sitting here. Some of them appear to have their canvas tilted back to receive light on it, and then they would be drawing on their canvas with a funny tilted angle. So for a second, let's just say never mind the sight size discussion for a second. But when you're looking at these, don't think of these as ideal circumstances, ideal situations. The ideal thing to do with your canvas is make sure that your canvas is always setting toward you in the relationship that the viewer will have, right? Then whatever you draw, if you draw relationally and all that sort of thing, whatever you draw will be right to the viewer when he's looking at it, right? If you draw that way, if you draw with it set up the way the viewer will see it. So that's a big deal. In a lot of these situations, these guys with their easels and different ways of setting up have no chance whatever of, some of them aren't even setting, like if you're sitting down doing a small drawing, it's fine to do that. Just make sure the drawing is facing you. Don't have it laying on your lap facing away because the distortion's inevitable. Right? I don't see it, but so there are problems like that even with all these guys. So don't make into it. All this stuff is problematical, but it's based on the circumstances. You're sort of stuck with stuff, with top light, with thousands of people, with, with whatever it is, with funny kinds of easels that may be problematical for getting those kinds of angles. We take a lot for granted these days about what we actually have. So you're following what I'm talking about so far. I'm going to go find some other images for you in this one. There are a number of things that he says, and he quotes other people, but there are a number of things that he says that I don't agree with, and I've said that before. But so he shows this picture here of Tarbell painting a portrait that I think was in a show recently that we all saw. And he's showing him standing next to the easel, which he wouldn't have been doing to paint that portrait because the viewing he's looking at, he's not looking down here, he's walking back, and so that is set up rather as a sight size. Then he says, but you can see that this is smaller than that. Well, it could very well be, but depending on where he's standing, it might appear to be the same size as that, right? So it doesn't mean that he's not doing sight size in this situation as a placement on the floor. But if you ask, that is he doing sight size in that measuring process? Look how he's not lining things up. That's a point this Bilmes makes very well. That the angle here is not the same thing as matching horizontal, heights, on a horizontal ruler. So, yeah, you have to kind of look at those pictures. And here's what, in the Barg book and all those other places, so to see what the difference is if you haven't actually used this stuff. But I don't think you need to know anything about this. I think what you really need to know is that your job as a student is to be able to paint with authority and accuracy what you see. You have to have that power. And Relational will give you that power and just work it through, right? You don't have to go looking for it. There's no trick solutions, and measuring beforehand isn't one. Any more than, I say to people, if you want to do that, I really do mean it seriously. Take a photograph, stand back enough distance back so you don't have distortion in the lens. Take a photograph and trace it. Because you're not there any more than, in this process, in the sight size process, any more than you're there, so to speak, in the camera when you take a photograph. Now, here's another one where Paxton is obviously painting a thing that would be way over in distance, way bigger than this, would not appear to be the same size. And Paxton, remember, being Gamble's teacher, might have been, thought of as possibly he was doing something he would never do. How would I say that? But in the meantime, by the way, you see him up here making his marks on the canvas. When painters stand up here next to the canvas, make their marks, they're trying to be in a position for the photographer, so the guy can say, here's the artist, the pictures I can have in his image, the model, the artist, and the painting all at the same time. So it doesn't mean he stood there and just stood there and stood there and stood there and stood there. He did walk back, or he wouldn't have been telling Gamble and us to do that same thing. He stood back and looked at the model from a greater distance, where the size would have been more similar, but more importantly, where he would have been able to see the entire thing at once. That's a classic conversation. You got to be able to see the top of this little head while you're looking down at this elbow here. You got to be able to see the thing as a whole, right? So if you're not back far enough, if you're sitting up here on this thing and just drawing this and then drawing this and just drawing this, when are you going to see this, right? So when you first block in stuff, the right thing to do is to be at the right distance, right? Even if you're just doing some other method, like even construction painting, drawing. All right, let me find you some other stuff. I think there's a couple other points in here that I just use them, by the way, because they enable me to talk about various points. So let's see, that's Duran. Yeah, and this is another one of those cases where this is for, now I don't know when the frame came on this picture, so the picture is well in hand, right? So if he's doing small stuff, he's doing it because he's looking at a small area, and when you're looking at a small area, it's already been established in major ways, by color, by size, by form, and all those ways. When you're going to add some level of detail, you can stand closer because it's a waste of time walking back and forth, and you don't need to. And small areas don't require it because you can see the entire height and width, even of the head itself. You can be in a proximity to your canvas, where you actually can see this height here is actually 1, 2, 3. So you can get rid of that distortion they talk about, right? But it is the crucial thing. You're getting back some distance, not for perspective distortion correction that Da Vinci talks about, but because of the incapacity as an impressionist to see the thing as a whole, right? To see the bottom while you're looking at the top. That's why you get back. And the need to see the thing as a whole is because the music exists as a whole, right? So you need to see what this red is up to, to this one, to that, to whatever. You need to see those things because they're all in it together as a game. So, all right. I keep looking down because I'm worried about going way long again. Yeah, here's another one where they have him seated. This one here is what I consider the most problematical thing in the world. They have him seated, doing this whole thing, right? My guess is if he's seated, he's probably doing something small. He's already set up the whole thing, and he's doing something small for some reason, maybe because he just got tired and didn't want to stop painting. Who knows what? But the idea that you can sit and do a painting this big is like, radically ludicrous. You cannot do that if you actually intend to have relationships to look right to, the parts to the whole. Now, there have been developed any number of methodologies for avoiding that, and one of them is, you do the preliminary drawing, and then you just trace the whole thing onto your canvas. And then in theory, you could sit up there and just do the head and then do the hand and all that sort of thing. The drawing, at least, would be relational, right? But once you become a color perspectivist, I'm a color impressionist, then the wholeness of the color relations all matters. So when you're first putting marks down, if you're not doing drawing, if you're not painting on a drawing that's already fixed, which again is this kind of thing that we see Richard Lack talking about in the Realism and Revolution thing. And so he talks about doing a grisaille and all these things, well, they all do the drawing first, doing it at whatever size you want, project it, or stand back, whatever, but get the drawing done, and then you work piecemeal and sight size. Yeah, I guess you could say that actually, piecemeal, but then you could theoretically at least sit down for a while. You'd still have to get back at some point to the right distance. But that's one of the interesting things. Was he really painting this guy sitting down, so he's looking up at him? Because he might have been. And actually in that case, it's entirely possible that he was. But it creates such an enormous number of problems. If I was doing it, I'd put the guy up on a model stand. Maybe he is up on one. And no, he's not. So you wouldn't have to crawl around on the floor like this if you want him to be elevated. And then you could walk back and forth, and he would keep his height, relatively speaking. Anyway, I don't want to get into that deeper and deeper, but yeah, I don't know why he put that there. I don't know what that image is for. But this is where I was telling you that if this guy is standing this close to looking at a drawing that vertical, that is the right angle to his eye. But if he were to stand back, that wouldn't be the right angle to his eye. But most of these guys look like they're actually tilting it so that there's some relationship to perpendicular to their eye of their paper. This guy, if he's sitting here, there's the center of this thing. Looks like it's perpendicular to his eye. That's a classic thing you must do in any case. So it's not a sight size thing. That's in any situation where you're working. You can't have it distorted. You can't have a paper lying back or tilted forward enormously and still maintain that. Okay. It may be about the limit of what I need to say here, Lynn. This one is, as I said earlier, this one's rather a bit deceptive. This is offered as Jerome drawing a model. And that's where a camera, if you stand, if depending where the photographer, if he's way across the room, this guy could be way in front of her and actually look to be the same size. And I'm talking about, for example, maybe 100 feet across the room, and the guy using a lens. You've seen that when you're watching a baseball game. If the shot is from way out in center field, the pitcher and the batter look almost exactly the same size. They feel very oddly too similar, right? Whereas if you were standing at second base, the batter would look like he was less than half the size of the pitcher, right? So things like that photographs can be misleading. But this still could very well be a case in which he's already made up his mind about things and he's just using the model for vague references. And that, when you're doing imaginative painting, is rather, to me, a commonplace. But it assumes that you're doing something that isn't impressionistic. Anyway, yeah. Anyway, so yeah, he's showing these things from all these different locations. Different people doing different things in relation to the model. So this would be one where he's showing the painting is far away from the model, right? But again, that could easily be a situation where a guy could occasionally put the painting back. This painting is finished. He's sitting there. His painting is finished. So he could be just, as I said, getting himself into the picture so the photographer can have a nice shot. Or else he's just working. He's got so much finished. He could be working on very, very small areas. Anyway, there's a number of things like that are totally irrelevant to the idea of sight size. I think, but so I think that yeah, that covers it. But actually, I recommend that you do look up this thing and even communicate with this guy, Semyon. Where if he's coming out of a Russian training, they did maintain longer than we did. I see things happening now that are kind of funny coming out of some of the Russian ones. Something's going on there that isn't. It isn't what it used to be. It looks like to me, but and not sound, but to the degree that they have a more sound connection, a more continuous connection to those older guys, this would be definitely worth looking at. Now, this is not complete. So what I was actually saying to you is that I did a critique. Is this the one? I'm going to offer you this one. Unfortunately, it's in black and white on black, but this is a problem of sight size and construction drawing thing that I did. So I'm just going to put it up on the screen like this and let it sit there for a few minutes. You can go ahead and if you have any way of photographing it, so you can read it, you can do it. Otherwise, if you can't, why don't you just go ahead and write to me and ask me for any of these written materials I have on sight size and construction drawing and all those things and what the relative problems are. All right, I've gone long again. Lynn, I hope I've come close to at least addressing significant parts of this stuff you talked about. And I'm sure I've completely forgotten something, but let's leave it at that for this time. All right, thank you. Share, like, comment, etc. And we'll pick it up next time. 100, huh? 101 coming up. Cool stuff. All right. By the way, I will say this, that we're going to the videos. We're probably going to be doing 2 a week again instead of 3. There's got to be problematical on numbers of levels, people getting busy and things like that. So, but we'll still have occasionally a third one. So it'll probably be Thursdays and Sundays again. So enjoy what you can of this, get what you can out of it, and otherwise just totally ignore it. Talk to you later.